Today is October 2, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform starts its operation. My name is Vasil Samokhvalov. Now we will be talking about Ukrainian political prisoners. We'll be talking about Ukrainian political prisoners with an accent on Crimea. And we will be talking about the tortures that are committed by Russians, used by Russians against them, specifically denying access for the prisoners to proper medical care. Well, I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Victoria Nesterenko, project manager at ZMINA Human Rights Center, Iryna Sedova, a researcher at the Crimean Human Rights Group, and Borys Petrunyok, researcher and documentarian at ZMINA Human Rights Center. We'll start with Miss Victoria, who will show us the presentation and describe the situation, what's going on there, who provides the evidences to us, where do they come from, and then we will be talking about who should be brought to liability for that and in what way. Please. Well, generally we know that since the beginning of this year, 2 Crimean political prisoners have died in Russian prisoners, Jamil Gafarov and Konstantin Prism. They had chronic diseases, they required permanent medical attention, but this medical aid was not provided for them in the prisons. Respectively, it unfortunately resulted in their death. However, in Russia, no one was brought to liability for those 2 deaths. And this is why now, in coordination with the experts of Crimean Human Rights Group, we're studying this issue, the issue of non-provision of medical aid to the prisoners and the liability of the people responsible for that. And now we will be presenting the list of people who are directly or indirectly involved in such denying of access to medical aid. This list has 22 people on it now. They are the prosecutors, judges, the heads of confinement cells and prisons, the heads of medical services in occupied Crimea and Russian Federation. Generally, we know that now in Russia and in occupied Crimea there are about 186 political prisoners. Many of them are kept in conditions without provision of proper medical aid, and respectively, those people that you see currently on the screen, they are directly involved in this denial of access to medical aid for the prisoners. The judges, again, the prosecutors who are related to this problem one way or another. This is the sanction list that we will hand over to the government authorities, to the law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, so that prosecutor's office could study those cases and open criminal cases against them. Then the list will be handed over to the international institutions for imposition of sanctions over those people. That's clear, Ms. Iryna? For what I understand, you will be giving us the specific names, but before you call them, I would like to ask you about the principle, how they were picked. I understand they're the representatives of a penitentiary service, prosecutor's office, the judges, as you said. So what was the principle you were putting this list together based upon? So we studied this issue of denial of access to medical aid for a number of years, and this list should include probably a couple of hundreds of people, but here we've picked the top level government officials or high-ranking servicemen like colonel of penitentiary service, the judges who convicted like 10 people as a judge. So we've gathered the people whose crimes are evidenced by a number of evidences, but if we also include the lower level officials and law enforcement officers. This list will include even more people. We're still gathering the evidences against them so we could hand over their cases to international organizations and Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. So those people on this list, they were directly involved in denial of access to medical aid, specifically for those medical units where they were supposed to treat the prisoners, but they did not do so intentionally. Like Jamil Gafarov was in the confinement cell in Simferopol, and his lawyer was appealing to the authorities to provide all the information about Jamil Gafarov, why he was being denied access to medical aid. But the heads of those institutions intentionally did not provide any such information, and even after the death of Jamil Gafarov, 3 years have passed. The lawyer was requesting the document from Simferopol Penitentiary Institution, and they still do not provide such documents about his death. In the same way, though, there was an institution operating in Rostov-on-Don where the condition of Jamil Gafarov even deteriorated, and still no documents were provided to the lawyers. So those people, they still enjoy their impunity, but we want to bring them to liability because, for example, the citizen of Belarus, Natalia Berhan, she was the head of this medical unit number 91 in Simferopol back in year 2018. Then she moved to Moscow and she works in a different healthcare institution. She's the manager of penitentiary service, and she acts as a reputed medical specialist so that everybody forgets about her crimes. But we don't want any impunity for her. Everybody should remember that this citizen, it was intentionally concealing from lawyers and other people or other involved parties all the information about the illness of Jamil Gafarov, no matter that the person was requiring serious medical support. And also we want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that these people, they may be living abroad, having rest and recreation there. There were cases like that when the criminals were coming to Finland for vacation. So we want to prevent it. We want to make sure that they know that the fair justice is waiting for them. I hope that it will happen soon, that we will bring them to liability. Okay, can you explain how does it happen practically? A person ends up in a confinement cell, they write some requests, some appeals, so then those requests are being laid as fundamentals for such cases as you gather. So we have people in Crimea who submit the documents and then they hand over those documents to us. Also, we do the OSINT intelligence. We open the data from the websites of Crimean judges. They started hiding this information, but during previous years they were posting the information about prosecutors and judges who were involved in persecuting of those citizens. And now that the full-scale invasion had started, they removed all the information from their websites, but we have it. So what kind of torture is this denial of access to medical aid? Well, apart from not examining people medically, even the relatives are being denied from handing over the medicines to them. The people know their diagnosis, they know what medicines they have, but the administration of the prison may say, like, this powder may look like cocaine and this is why we are not you cannot hand over this thing to a prisoner. For example, Iryna Murmich has otitis, and she says, my ear hurts, like I need medicines, I need those drops for the ear. They say no, nothing hurts. the representatives of medical institutions who are supposed to work in those confinement cells, they say, no, we're not going to treat you. So that's the intentional crime. This is how those representatives, those criminals, the representatives of penitentiary system, torture the prisoners. And even if like in case of Jamil Gafarov, he was brought to a hospital for examination, he was attached to his bunk with a handcuff, and the doctor said, you're a terrorist, I'm not even going to approach you. And then after the fabricated examination, they said, like, Jamil Gafarov is not ill, no critical illnesses are identified. And this document is a part of our investigation too. We have it available for us. Well, I understand there are crimes, there is a list, there are documents. Well, Ms. Borys, what are the further... What is the further fate of those documents? What's going to happen to them? Well, I would like to add a couple of words regarding the people that we pay attention to during gathering information, so everybody understands the bigger picture about what's going on. Frequently, the human rights people and law enforcement agencies in Ukraine, they pay attention to the judges who come up with unjust awards in violation of the international humanitarian law, but in compliance with the law of Russian Federation in occupied Crimea. But there is a cohort of judges who come up with some intermediary awards, and they are all confirmed with other documents. So basically, the judge comes up with the unjust award knowingly, like intentionally knowing that the people are ill and their non-treatment in the confinement cell will result in deterioration of their health. Also, there are other people involved who act as witnesses on the prosecutor's side, and they also contribute to this situation. Also, as Ms. Iryna mentioned, the heads of medical units of confinement cells and prisons, they either formally react to the complaints, to the health conditions, and sometimes there are cases when a defendant submits a claim and they are being transferred to even worse detention conditions, and we're talking here about the people of older age with chronic diseases. It's a very threatening situation. We also talk about the representatives of so-called regional commissioners for human rights. Those people are supposed to supervise the compliance with the rights of people in their places of detention, but they don't only formally approach their responsibilities, but they are part of this system of unjust court awards. And what can we do about it? How can we react? Getting back to your question, I would like to emphasize that the instrument of sanctions that we're talking about here is not an instrument of justice. We have to segregate it. It's the instrument of political logic when we have to react to some critical situation to make sure that the policy changes, the policy of Russian Federation in a very specific field. And so far we cannot provide the fair justice for those people. We are trying to influence the situation with a soft force, and imposition of sanctions over those people doesn't necessarily mean that there will be no legal liability against them. So who imposes the sanctions? The sanctions are imposed by Ukraine, by our partner countries, by international organizations, but specifically, well, it's United States who can impose the sanctions, countries of European Union, so that we all understand the Human Rights Foundation for those sanctions, for violation of fundamental human rights. It's one of the biggest causes for imposition of sanctions. There is the specific regime in European Union. The same type of list also exists in the United States. So this Human Rights Foundation is quite powerful, so we shouldn't create an illusion for them that this instrument doesn't work or this problem is something that is not so important to us for the time being, because the reaction to violations in Crimea should complement the reaction to violations that were committed after the year 2022. So they kind of intensify each other. So I think that the international reaction should also pay attention to the fact that those sanctions and reaction to violation is like uncovering of this evil. We bring it to light. We try to stop those critical processes with the politically motivated persecution in the occupied territories, and this is how we want to help the people who stay there to stop that conveyor of politically motivated persecution. Are there any other legal instruments on top of sanctions, since tortures are the crime, and I think it's the crime that falls under the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court? Is persecution of such people possible not only in Ukrainian but also foreign jurisdictions? I think that such persecution is possible and it will be happening. We have, again, getting back to Russian human rights commissioners, we have the case of Lvova Belova, who was accused in deportation along with her associate. Yeah, obviously. And again, I think the sanctions were imposed on her, and it didn't save her from criminal persecution. So I think that there are prospects. I just don't want to comment on the legal part of it, because here we have to pay attention to collection of evidences in the places of detention, evidences of what can be evaluated as tortures. There is a number of obstacles on this way, but I'm sure that the liability will be coming for all of those perpetrators. So on whose desk is this list going to end up? Is it going to be the NSDC, other law enforcement agencies? Yes, we will hand those lists over to our law enforcement agencies and they will end up in NSDC eventually, and also we will forward it to our international partners so they react to these situations and impose sanctions on perpetrators in their jurisdictions, because as you may understand, there are people there regarding whose the cases on high treason were initiated. So they're basically Ukrainian citizens, and law enforcement agencies of Ukraine are already investigating the cases they're involved in, but it doesn't necessarily mean an obstacle for our foreign partners to persecute them or impose sanctions on them. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions on the floor? Muslив Amerov, Suspilne Crimea. I will probably have a question to Ms. Iryna. Is it possible to monitor the violation of human rights, the rights of our political prisoners from Crimea who are being transported to Russian Federation? Is it generally possible? Because, for example, today's case with Neriman Jalal, he has problems with his legs. Is it possible to monitor his condition as he ends up in Russian Federation? Well, generally, the information about the violation of human rights is something that we get from the lawyers and relatives of those political prisoners, because they can still stay in contact with them. So this monitoring is the information that can be obtained by our hidden monitors. Sometimes they send the documents that the medical aid was not provided to the prisoners, but mostly it comes from the lawyers and their families. So we document all that information because sometimes it contains the last names of those who are guilty of denying access to medical aid. So this is how it's being documented. And a little bit to add. So it's not only about Neriman Jalal. We see that within the last 2 months, from Crimea to Russia, there were 4 political prisoners transported who have serious problems with their health. First of all, Iryna Danilovich, then I apologize, I don't remember quite clearly. Iryna Sedova, Yupov, and the lawyer of Nariman Jalal says that he is about to be transported too. It's not yet quite clear. The problem is why Russia transports people from occupied Crimea to Russian Federation. It's one of the ways of pressure on the political prisoners and their families, because when they are closer to their homes, the relatives, the families can at least try to help them. They have hope that the medicines would reach the prisoner, and the lawyers and the activists of Crimean Solidarity, it's easier for them to help the people in confinement cells in Crimea, but as soon as they are transported to remote places in Russia, really it's very difficult to find mechanisms to find a way out of this situation, specifically talking about the political prisoners who have problems with their health, who require permanent medical support, require some treatment. And what the families try to do, then they ask to have the prisoners transported back closer to their homes, but usually it just ends with nothing. And another mechanism is trying to find lawyers, normal lawyers in Russian Federation, who would really defend them rather than acting as if they defend somebody. More questions? Good afternoon, Mikhail Potocki, Poland. The repressions in Crimea are going on for 9 years already. Can we say about some waves of repressions when they were more intense and less intense, and how did the beginning of the full-scale invasion influence this process? Well, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the persecution obviously intensified because they are afraid that there will be an organized resistance to occupation, that it will be reinforced, so people are being persecuted just for everything. And if before the beginning of the full-scale invasion the Crimean Tatars were coming at the front of the courthouse, they were communicating and exchanging information, now they're just being detained for coming there and support their co-citizens who are being convicted of fabricated cases. So the number of these cases increased, even for some words on the internet, even for posting an avatar looking like a Crimean flag. The people are being penalized. More people are being persecuted for evasion from service in the armed forces of Russian Federation. People don't want to do it after the beginning of the full-scale invasion because it's the threat to their life and health, because without any training they're being brought to the forward edge. Crimean Tatars are now mostly persecuted by those articles. I see those names increasing on the list of people being persecuted. People express their discontent with occupation in the social media, and those repressions, they only intensify, and we put together one large case which is called persecution. Persecution is the crime against humanity, and this persecution is going on for 9 years, as you've mentioned. Persecution for pro-Ukrainian position. So this is the case which covers all of our political prisoners who were punished and brought to liability under fabricated cases, like the case of Volodymyr Balak, who just put a Ukrainian flag and was put to prison. Like Nariman Jalal, he went to Kiev and had a public address here saying that Crimea is Ukraine, and there was a case fabricated against him for his pro-Ukrainian position that he never concealed. So it's such a massive crime, and if we collect all those evidences, we want to hand those evidences to the International Criminal Court so that all of the perpetrators can be brought to liability for persecution and crimes against humanity. More questions? Stanislav Kvich, former Kremlin prisoner, a journalist, you know I'm quite skeptical about identification of the people who were involved in tortures. For example, in my case and in case of Oleg Sentsov, is one of the most famous political prisoners and other political prisoners. When we were brought back home, the competent authorities, I mean the law enforcement agencies, they did not really care a lot about those facts. I had an interview with security service and they were only interested in my in the beginning of my case in Orel, you know, and they never really cared about my, so to say, adventures in the Northern Caucasus, where the most of the tortures were used against me. I lost parts of my body, so to say, like my teeth. Not a lot of time has passed since then, but again, interviewing and identification of those people is probably important, because it's yet another circle. Because if the tortures were used against me in Vladikavkaz, in the same way, Leni Umerova now ended up in this quite an exclusive place. And I think that the very same people, the very same team are involved in investigation process and in tortures as well. That's probably on the level of a remark, or you want to add something? Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who cooperates with us providing evidences, because this is why we do this job of ours, to support the work of law enforcement agencies, because the number of war crimes is only increasing, and the law enforcement officers, they leave for the forward edge of the battle area to take part in battle operations, and it's important so that evidences are collected not only by the law enforcement but the civil actors as well, so we can cooperate in this area. I would like to add a couple of words. Also, we have to pay attention to the fact that Russian Federation does not change and Russian law enforcement does not change, and what we've seen in Crimea, in Russia, or occupied Donbass is just scaling up. All those practices of random detention, the tortures, and the way it's happening, it's all repeating itself in the territories occupied after 24th February 2022. So this is why we gather all this information to help the law enforcement agencies, and I hope it will have some solid results. So I just want to add about how easy or difficult it is to collect the evidences, the information. I know that this confinement cell in Simferopol, it's now more difficult to get any information from there. So is it so? Yes, definitely it has become more difficult, because they increased the pressure on the lawyers who work in Russian Federation. If a lawyer signs a document that they would not disclose any information, if such information was leaking from the from a lawyer, it contemplated administrative liability, so now they changed it to criminal liability. And for any lawyers, even if they didn't sign any non-disclosure obligations, there may be cases fabricated against the lawyers anytime. They close the access to the websites of the courts of Russian Federation from anywhere but Russian Federation. Before that, we could go to those websites and to see what they were doing. So now we're losing this piece of information. Also, they removed that information they were posting earlier from the websites of the courts. Now the names of the judges are hidden, and there are no mentionings of any political cases, like cases of Crimean Muslims, Ukrainian political prisoners. They disappeared from the website of Kyiv Court of Simferopol, or Kiev District Court of Simferopol. We know they're just trying to conceal this information because they understand that the punishment is coming closer, that the Crimean Peninsula is about to be liberated, and this is why they started removing that information from Crimean courts websites. In Moscow region, the Russians have not yet realized it. They think that they still enjoy impunity, but I hope that we will get them sooner or later. Thank you very much. I think this is where we are about to wrap up. Joining us were Victoria Nesterenko, project manager ZMINA Human Rights Group, Iryna Sedova, a researcher at the Crimean Human Rights Group, and Borys Petrunyok, researcher and documentarian at ZMINA Human Rights Group. See you shortly.